Welcome everyone to the UN Global Compact Academy. Thank you so much for joining us today. The UN Global Compact Academy is a learning platform designed to provide participants the knowledge and skills they need to meet their sustainability objectives. Today's session is dedicated to help companies thinking about setting a science-based target to know and learn how to do so. My name is Heidi Husko, and I will be your facilitator today. I'm here with our great partners and experts from the Science-Based Targets Initiative, who will help share information and the requirements on how you can set a science-based target. I also want to mention that we will be recording today's session, and it'll be made available on our websites afterwards. The Science-Based Targets Initiative mobilizes companies to set science-based targets and boost the company's advantage in the transition to a low-carbon economy. We are a collaboration between CDP, the UN Global Compact, World Resources Institute, and WWF, and as well one of the Women Business Commitments. We define and we promote the best practice in science-based target setting and offer resources and guidance to reduce barriers to adopt science-based targets. And we have a great team of technical experts who independently assess and approve science-based targets. So today I have with me colleagues from the Science-Based Targets Initiative. They're Nate Aden, who's a senior fellow at WRI, Alexander Fasan, he's the global lead of Science-Based Targets with WWF International, and Alberto Carrillo Pineda, who is the Director of Science-Based Targets and Renewable Energy at CDP. You should have all received the speaker bios before joining the webinar today, so I won't take too much details of going into the great eminent speakers that we have. We have lots of content that we want to focus on with you today. And leading up to COP21 in 2015, companies were really at the forefront with making public commitments such as science-based targets and carbon pricing, etc. And today we really see that science-based targets is becoming mainstream business practice to help to bridge the current gap to keep our planet's warming well below 2 degrees Celsius. And business can really play a critical role in fighting climate change. Companies have the power to transform a society. Public commitments, such as science-based targets, will help business raise the confidence of governments to enhance their national policies by 2020. Now is the time for business leaders to embrace climate action across local markets everywhere and pioneer pathways forward to sustainable future for all. This session is aimed to help you to be part of the movement taking climate action and to start implementing the Paris Agreement. Over the next 1 hour and 15 minutes, we will provide you with some concrete insights and answers to the questions on what is a science-based target, how to prepare setting a science-based target, what is and how to use the criteria of the Science-Based Targets Initiative, also on what are corporate leaders saying on science-based targets, as well as what happens next after you have made the commitment to the Science-Based Targets Initiative. And to help you understand what it looks like in practice, we are very lucky to have with us Marie-Pierre Busquiot, who is the Nature Finance Director at Danone. She's here to share Danone's experiences and give us examples on how and why Danone is one of the Science-Based Targets Initiative leading companies. So thank you everyone who has shared questions beforehand. We have tried to make sure that these questions are covered during our session here today. However, there will be a live Q&A that you see at the bottom of your screen. We really encourage you to use that throughout the session, so please go in and type your questions, and either we will answer them throughout, and then we also have 2 segments later on in the session where we will be speaking to some of the questions that you have submitted. So let's dive into our first segment and start with the basics. What is a science-based target, and also what is the business case for setting a science-based target? With the Paris Agreement in force, business and investors have a critical role to play in climate-proofing our global economy and ensuring a swift transition to a low-carbon resilient world. The Paris Agreement represents a watershed moment for climate action and sends a powerful signal, market signal to business. Science-based targets provide a way forward for companies to define that pathway to future-proof growth by specifying how much and how quickly they need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in line with the goal of the Paris Agreement. The challenge now is to bring all sectors of all societies and economies into alignment with the Paris Agreement ambition to limit global warming average temperature to well below 2 degrees, aiming for 1.5 degrees, and ensure in parallel the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. The UN Environment Gap Report tells us that current national targets reflected in the so-called national determined contributions will put us on a 3-degree scenario. However, we need these policies to reflect a 1.5 to 2 degrees trajectory. And this is where business leadership comes in very importantly and very handy. And we also can see on this graph that business as usual would put our emissions of the planet to much as 4.8 degrees, which would have catastrophic effects. Therefore, the next years are critical to gain this global movement of action, and we need to make serious efforts to turn the tides in the next couple of years and support the global processes by ramping up climate ambition and bending this curve already by 2020. This is where science-based targets comes in very handy. We need to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions to less than 42 gigatons CO2 by 2030. With each sector's carbon budget and growth trajectory, you can consider science-based targets the new normal in the way businesses are developing their strategies for the future. In other words, the Science-Based Targets Initiative helped translate your company's global climate goals with the Paris Agreement. Science-based targets are greenhouse gas emission reduction targets consistent with the level of the decarbonization that is required to keep global temperature increase within 1.5 and 2 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels. So as a summary, the science-based targets are greenhouse gas emission reduction targets aligned with the latest climate science for keeping aggregated global warming well below 2 degrees Celsius. Science-based targets provide companies with a clearly defined pathway to future-proof growth by specifying how much and how quickly they need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Science-based targets also challenge companies to transform their business and help create a low-carbon economy. And science-based targets go beyond just setting targets based on what is comfortable at the moment, but rather set science-based vision for where emissions need to go. So let's start with our first poll for today. I will ask Sam to put it up here. I'll read it out loud for you. What is the biggest business case for your company? So do you think that the biggest case for your company to make science-based targets is to increase efficiency to be more competitive? Is it a brand reputation booster? Is it to unlock new financial returns, attract investors, preempt policy changes and regulatory risk, future-proof growth, or anything else? And I'll leave it there for a little while, and I'm sure that you've already selected, and we can have a look at the voting. All right, so most of you today are voting for brand reputation booster, as well as the future-proof growth. And the third most one is increase efficiency to be more competitive. And I think that your answers actually aligns well with what we recently saw. We did actually just survey our companies who have set a science-based target, and we found that 1 in 5 executives with science-based targets emission reduction goals expect 100% of their company's products and services to be low carbon by 2028. The bottom line savings for nearly a third of companies as a result of ambitions setting emissions cutting goals as well. So we wanted to show this to make sure that you also have the business case in case you need to convince your peers or anyone else in your company who might not be in your team who needs to have the figures of why you should set a science-based target. So with that said, I want to introduce Nate Aden, who will show you how to prepare for a science-based target. Nate is with WRI and is one of our experts on the methodologies and been with the initiative from the very start. So I'll hand it over to you now.
Thank you, Heidi, and thank you to UN Global Compact colleagues for setting up today's great webinar. Great to connect with a global audience and help advance this initiative. So today I'll be talking about how to prepare setting a science-based target. We generally break this preparation and technical phase into 3 aspects. The first is the emissions scenario, where the most common scenarios that are out there and publicly accessible are the International Energy Agency's 2-degree scenario and beyond 2-degree scenario. These are published in the IEA's Energy Technology Perspectives series of reports and spreadsheets, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. The second is the IPCC's 5th assessment report, which included representative concentration pathways, which are the summary emission scenarios. And RCP 2.6 is the ambitious pathway that corresponds with 2.6 watts per square meter of radiative forcing. And that's a scenario that corresponds with a high level of ambition at this point. The second basic aspect here is the allocation approach, and the 3 that we summarize are absolute contraction, intensity convergence, and intensity compression. So I'll explain these in more detail later, but these affect the basic budget that sectors and companies get. And then the third is the company-specific context in terms of the sectors that the company is involved in, the location of the company in terms of, for example, the electricity generation resources that are available to the company, the growth of the company in the sector, and then the initial carbon intensity of the company compared to its peers and over time. So the next slide shows the first step, which is selecting a scenario. So as Heidi mentioned, the general orientation here is around the Paris Agreement, which is highly negotiated from 2015, but the general direction is well below 2 degrees with an aspiration to 1.5. The level of aspiration and feasibility is debated, but this is the general approach of the initiative. And at this point, we are aligned with Paris in the sense that we look to 1.5, but the minimum ambition pathway that we require of companies is the 2-degree pathway. This slide summarizes some of the probabilities that correspond with the scenarios that I mentioned earlier. So you can see that there's a range of levels of rigor and likelihood of stabilizing climate this century around 1.5 or 2 degrees. Again, our minimum threshold for the initiative is this 50% 2 degrees C, which many companies already consider to be quite ambitious. But we, of course, support additional ambition and moving beyond that. And so we provide resources for companies to explore the levels of ambition beyond that as well. This slide gets to that second aspect, which is the allocation approach that I mentioned. So the basic idea here is that in the fifth assessment report from the IPCC, there was an orientation towards cumulative carbon budgets as a way to summarize a lot of inputs and variables into a single number that can correspond with the climate outcome. And so we've taken that approach and broken it down to the sector and company level. And so this is just a basic illustration of how that works. In calculus terms, you're integrating the area under the curve to get that cumulative budget, but in simpler terms, you're just adding together the annual emissions. And many of the sector pathways that we're looking at include what we call a peak and decline trajectory. And so you can see that here, it's rising in the near term and then quickly declining to a much lower level over time. And these curves and pathways will vary per sector in some of our approaches. And so I'll go into that a little bit later. This slide shows it a little bit more, sort of breaking it down to the company level. So you can see that the idea is that we're aggregating up from all of the companies in a particular sector, and then at the sector level to a global annual emissions budget, which calculates to this, which contributes to this global carbon budget. Over time, the expected remaining carbon budget is about 1,000 gigatons CO2 remaining. This has come down. The fifth assessment report was published several years ago now, and indeed global emissions have continued to grow. So that means that the remaining budget is just getting smaller and smaller in order to have these 1.5 or 2 degree stabilization pathways. So I mentioned these allocation approaches. That's the second element here, and they can be a bit abstract at first. And so these figures are meant to help to convey what they mean. The first one is one that we generally call absolute contraction. And it's this sort of Kantian idea that everyone acts in parallel. And so the basic approach here is that all sources that are emitting in 2010 or presently reduce their emissions in parallel over the period to 2050. And this takes the basic high-level number from the fifth assessment report of 49% below 2010 by 2050, being that minimum threshold for having a likelihood of stabilizing at 2 degrees. And this approach is appealing to many companies because it's quite simple. However, of course, it doesn't account for growth or equity or any distributional aspects. And so it's a bit simple and limiting for some companies and situations. The second approach is what we call the compression approach. And this takes intensity, and it says the intensity of all the companies must be reduced in parallel. And so you can see that it's similar to contraction, except that it's in intensity terms. This is something that we apply when we have especially physical intensities, though sometimes we use this with economic intensities as well. The third approach is what we call convergence. You can see obviously it converges by 2050. And this is an approach that we sometimes take with companies that are in sectors that have physical intensity data. And so, for example, if you have relatively homogeneous companies that are producing, for example, cement, then we can have clear pathway numbers of grams CO2 per ton of clinker or cement to guide the company's ambition moving forward. The next slide shows the third element here, which is taking into account the company's specific information. And I mentioned these earlier, but the sector and regional spread can make a difference, especially, as I mentioned, in terms of access to different types of electricity generation resources. Initial carbon intensity is an issue, and we don't, this initiative is really about setting targets and forward ambition. So we think it's great when companies have already invested a lot and are good performers, but this isn't about rewarding previous work and previous performance. It's really looking forward and trying to align future targets and activities with these emissions pathways and outcomes that I mentioned. Expected organic growth is an issue across companies. I'd say generally, given this is a voluntary initiative, we have a lot of growth among these companies, and that these are high performers that are sort of demonstrating the competitiveness and long-term strategic benefits of this type of thinking. So there is a lot of growth among these companies, and that's something that we obviously don't seek to penalize. The basic idea here is that companies can continue to grow while reducing emissions, and our now more than 120 accepted targets helps to demonstrate that. And then finally, companies have different cycles of planning and investment, divestment. Some companies and sectors are more or less capital intensive and have sort of chunkier investments. And so that makes a difference for the company situation as well in terms of timing. The next slide sort of brings everything together. And so you can see those elements that I mentioned in terms of the different allocation approaches here in the columns. So absolute contraction, as I mentioned, intensity compression, and intensity convergence. And the SDA there refers to the Sector Decarbonization Approach, which is a method that we developed with a consultancy based off of that International Energy Agency work that I mentioned earlier from their Energy Technology Perspectives document. And this also shows, the input from scenarios, companies, and then the output in terms of the different types of targets that companies develop. Generally, I'm one of the technical reviewers on the initiative, and generally when we receive target submissions, we look at it in terms of the absolute impact of any target, but that doesn't mean that companies have to only communicate in absolute terms. Intensity targets are fully acceptable as well, and we'll go into the criteria a little bit later in this webinar. The next slide just provides an overview of the sector decarbonization approach. Many companies really like this approach because it's a least cost optimization approach. And so basically what it does is it looks at demand for, let's say, steel or cement or aluminum or chemicals out to 2060 at this point. And then given those demand levels and the marginal abatement costs across sectors, it finds a least cost approach to maintaining those carbon budgets that I mentioned. And so at this point, the ETP, which is the foundation of the SDA, includes that 2-degree scenario and beyond 2-degree scenarios with the corresponding probabilities that I showed earlier. The other thing about this approach, the SDA, that companies tend to like is that it can show sort of current and future expected best practice based on existing technologies in terms of emissions intensity. And this is generally physical emissions intensity. So the SDA is quite useful for companies that are in these relatively homogeneous sectors and are interested in understanding sort of current average intensities and where they're going moving forward. So the next slide gives a list of the sectors that are covered. So you could sort of see part of this in the last slide, but here you can see that the sectors covered are generally, as I said, relatively homogeneous. As part of our scaling up and support for new sectors, we have a new tool in transport that is now available through our website. And I would encourage any companies with large transport-related emissions to check that out. We also have commercial buildings and then sort of traditional heavy industrial sectors there. The next slide provides a summary of the, a screenshot, sorry, of the SDA tool that we share via our website. And again, I would say that the SDA is recommended for companies that have emissions related to these particular sectors, or are interested in looking at this sort of average intensities to 2050. But for companies that don't have activities that are covered by the SDA, they can still set an emissions reduction target, and there are still methods available to guide them. It's just these other methods that I mentioned. So a lot of companies tend to get discouraged when their particular activities aren't covered by the SDA. Have no fear, there's still resources available to guide your target setting process. The next slide just shows some of the outputs of this SDA tool that's available online via our website. And you can see that it gives the company intensity versus the sector pathway intensity. And it shows the differential, if there is any, for the base year and the target year. So this is an overview of some of the preparation and target setting process and resources that are available. I would encourage all of you to check out our website. The Science Based Targets Initiative website has numerous tools and additional resources, especially on our methods page. So thanks everyone, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you so much, Nate, for showing us that and really also going through the tools that are available on our website. I think this is where we get a lot of questions generally. So thanks for also showing what the Excel tools looks like. It's very important to know that there is a lot of information that we've already provided that we're really also encouraging everyone to use. We're getting questions through the Q&A, which is great. We're saving a few for a little bit later. Right now, let's go to the second poll of the day. So we'll be testing a little bit around what you heard around the sectoral decarbonization approach. So there is no pathway for my sector under the SDA. Therefore, I cannot set a science-based target. Is this true or is this false? I'll let you think about it for a second or so, and then we'll look at the answers. All right, so 87% said false, and that was the correct answer. Nate, over to you for some reflections.
Good. Well, yes, I think this is good because it seems that I wasn't too unclear with you. For the 14% who answered true, I think that companies are often quite discouraged for, when they don't find their particular sector or activity in the SDA. But as I said, there are numerous other resources that we can point you to, and companies are welcome to contact the initiative when they have questions and are looking for additional guidance. Just one other thing that I'll mention is that the SDA is based off of these average global intensities, and so I think it's useful for companies to see sort of how they're declining and how they compare with the average global intensity for their particular sector. But it's also a limited tool, and it's not going to do everything for you and make you breakfast. It's just going to give you some information, and so there's a need to move beyond that. And often companies sometimes expect that it's going to give them everything, and so there's more you have to do beyond the SDA is the point there. But it's a great starting point, and we're happy to follow up and answer additional questions. Thanks, everyone.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Nate. So now it's time for us to move to the next segment of the session. We have Alexander Fersan from WWF who will walk us through the criteria. And actually sharpen up your ears, everyone. This is the one main single topic that we do get most questions around. Particularly, we do get questions around scope 3 criteria, and Alex will also cover that shortly. But first, Alex, I'll let you talk through how to actually contact us and show your commitment to science-based targets.
Yeah, just to pick up what Heidi said, I'm actually going to speak a little bit about, now you understood from Nate, of how you can actually set a science-based target, how you can actually apply that to become part of the Science-Based Target Initiative and actually publicly commit to setting a science-based target. The first step really is, sorry, I'm getting not being heard well. Switch. I hope this works better for everyone. Is this preferable?
Okay. We can't hear you so well. It would be great to try to see if we can hear you any better. Could you try now to speak up?
Does this work better?
There is a big echo, but you're definitely louder.
Okay, I think this should work best.
Let's go for it.
All right, thanks very much. Apologies for the complications. So yeah, let's move on to how we actually can apply science-based targets to your company and then commit publicly. So it's a 4-step process. It's pretty straightforward. It's 4 easy steps. The framework under which you can commit to the Science-Based Target Initiative is called the call to action. And the very first step is that you actually commit to setting a science-based target. And to do so, you can simply go to the Science-Based Target Initiative website and sign a commitment letter. It's a pretty straightforward document. And then you actually already get recognition for having committed publicly to setting a science-based target on the Science-Based Target website, but also on the Women in Business website, because science-based targets are actually a valid commitment under the Women in Business Coalition's call to action. So once you've committed to the target publicly, I guess that the main work starts. So you're supposed to develop a target, and as Nate has explained how to do so, you'll basically apply the methodologies that we have provided and that are out there, but you also need to make sure that you actually align with all the key criteria that we require to be to have an approved science-based target. And I'll explain some of the key criteria here today, but there is a complete list of the criteria on the website, and I think it's also worth noting that these criteria get regularly updated. So in an annual cycle, the target validation criteria will slightly change depending on feedback that we get, but also just to improve and align with the latest science. The next step after that is that you submit your target. If you could please go back to the previous slide. The next step then is that you submit your target for validation at the Science-Based Target Initiative. And for that, there is a target submission form that we've provided, and that really requires you to just enter all the key details around your target. So the baseline emissions, the assumptions, the methodologies used, all these kind of things. And to help you out with that, there's actually a submission form guidance document. So again, you'll have most of the key information for that. And another resource is actually a FAQ section on the SBTI website. So between those 3 documents, I think most of the pressing questions should actually be answered. I think it's also worth noting that there's actually 2 different forms of a validation process. So on the one hand, there's a preliminary validation, so that is mainly used by companies to understand whether they're moving in the right direction, whether the target they're having is already applying the right methodologies, and get some feedback from the SBTI. And there is an official validation then where the companies are mainly seeking to get the stamp of approval and actually move towards that group of companies that are considered to have set a science-based target. Also worth noting briefly is that there's a new process that we're actually phasing in over the next 6 months or so. It starts in August. Ultimately, will become the regular process, and it's a premium target validation service, which will give you certainty around the timelines in which your target gets validated, and will give you a lot more information to help you understand how you're doing and where the gaps are really. So that's I guess a key resource for you. And finally, once your target's approved, you will actually be able to announce your target, and we will work together with you to make sure that you get all the information out there in a really coordinated way. We'll actually promote you on our channels and make sure that you get the most exposure you can get from this. Next slide, please. So before we move on to the criteria, a lot of you will be familiar with this, but just to reiterate, because it's very important to actually understand the criteria. This is the standard classification of corporate emissions that's developed by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. So Scope 1 emissions are those emissions that are actually directly resulting from your operations. So on the one hand, that's combustion of fuels, for example, in your boilers or in processes, but also in company-owned vehicles. That's I guess the Scope 1 category. That's where you have the most direct control over. And there's Scope 2 emissions. Those are in a way indirect emissions because you don't directly cause any operations, but they come from the purchased energy that you choose within your operations. And these emissions, these Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, build the core of what your science-based target applies to. So this is the primary emission boundary. But then going beyond Scope 1 and 2, there's Scope 3, and that's really a pretty broad range of emission categories. So it starts upstream with all the goods and services you purchase, so all the cradle-to-gate emissions of those. There's also the transport of those goods and services. There's business travel of your employees. There's the regular commuting of your employees. So a really broad range of activities. So all the emissions from those activities are considered Scope 3 emissions. And similarly, downstream, there's emissions from processing of your soil products in the use phase of your products. So, for example, if your products use energy during their life cycle, those emissions will be captured by that. And equally, the downstream transport and end of life. So as you can see, and if you're familiar with it, you probably already noticed that it's a lot more complex to monitor and measure and track those emissions. But they're particularly important because for the vast majority of companies, the bulk of their emissions will be in Scope 3 or in Scope 1 and 2. And this is also why it's important that they're being addressed by science-based targets. Next slide, please. We start with the criteria that specifically apply to those Scope 1 and 2 emissions. I think the first key point is that all of your Scope 1 and 2 emissions, as defined by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, have to be included into your target boundary. And it actually also applies to kind of exclusion thresholds. That includes the greenhouse gases, the specific ones that you're supposed to include. And it also includes criteria around some more specific details like bioenergy or biogenic emissions. So if you want to make sure that your target has the right boundary, we would like you to refer to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol standard. I think the next key criteria is around the base and the target years. So a key criteria is that the timeline of your target should be out at least 5 years, but no longer than 15 years. And the idea here really is that it gives you a long enough to actually drive transformative change within your organization, but at the same time, there's a level of accountability because those targets are not so far out that nobody that sets these targets will be around when they actually test. And I think another important aspect to consider is the baseline year. So in theory, you can, I guess, choose your baseline year relatively freely depending on your organization, but it's really important to understand that we recommend you use the latest year for which you have an inventory, and more importantly, the ambition of your target. So whether the reductions you're demonstrating or you're committing to are sufficient in terms of the ambition levels against 2 degrees will be measured against the previous year. So even if your target is against the 2005 baseline year, if you're submitting a target this year, we will check whether the reduction commitment is sufficient based on the previous year's target. So maybe we can go to the next slide to discuss the ambition. As I guess explained by Nate, there's a number of different scenarios that you can actually apply to, but the key criteria is that the level of ambition of reduction targets needs to be in line with the level of decarbonization required to keep global temperature increase to 2 degrees Celsius. And that's the minimum. We do, however, encourage companies to go beyond that because, as Nate has explained very well, this is the most conservative or the most minimum level that could be considered to be in line with the Paris Agreement, although the Paris Agreement, of course, points to actually a 1.5 degree trajectory. The next point is of absolute versus intensity targets. So there's a strong preference for absolute targets in line with the decarbonization required by 2050, and that actually gives you a very specific percentage reduction that you should achieve year on year, and that's more specifically set out in the start target criteria. But there's also the opportunity to have intensity targets, as explained by Nate previously. And in the next slide now, I'll actually start talking about maybe it's the most complex part, which is how to actually set targets for the Scope 3 emissions that we have. The first important step is that companies must complete Scope 3 screening. That means it's a very high-level assessment of all these 15 categories where you need to demonstrate where the emission hotspots are within your value chain, and need to demonstrate how your Scope 3 footprint compares to your Scope 1 and 2 footprint. And then a key decision point is whether your Scope 3 emissions account for more than 40% of your combined Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, which for the majority of companies, to be honest, will. A quick way of doing this, if you haven't really looked at Scope 3 emissions previously, is an online tool on the Greenhouse Gas Credit Pool website that they have developed with Quantis, and that will give you a really high-level assessment of whether you're roughly in the ballpark of more or less than 40%. I will also say that actually, if you want to set a target, you probably need to go beyond the detail of that tool, but it's a really good first step. Once you understand that you have to set a target, then you need to make sure that 2/3 of your Scope 3 emissions are within the boundary of that target. So you don't need to address everything, but 2/3 at minimum need to be included. And then the timeline requirements are very similar to what they were for Scope 1 and 2 emissions. So it's between 5 and 15 years. And again, we would recommend that you align your baseline year with the Scope 1 and 2 target, simply to provide some comparability. And in the next slide, I actually go into a bit more detail. So the key question is, what is a sufficient science-based target for Scope 3 emissions? And what you really can see is there's a bit of a hierarchy of preference. So the ideal case is that there is absolute emission reductions in line with Greece pathways. So very similar to what we've seen for Scope 1 and 2 emissions. You could have a linear year-on-year reduction of your absolute Scope 3 emissions aligned with the Paris emission. However, we do recognize that that's not necessarily possible, particularly if companies are growing fast. So there is an option of using a physical or an intensity reduction metric, and that actually allows companies that grow fast to contribute through the Scope 3 emissions to Paris future, but at the same time don't constrain their growth. And if you do choose this, it's important that either you fit into an SDA sector, so you can align the intensity with the SDA, or you can align your intensity against an economic metric, which would be the GVA approach. I will say that this gets pretty complex pretty quickly, so particularly if you want to apply the GVA approach, please get in touch with the SBTI beforehand, so we can give you a bit more specific guidance of how to apply GVA to this. And then finally, there is, I guess, a room for other targets that might be considered ambitious, and then we would kind of ask you to present a compelling case of why this is ambitious. And then it becomes a bit more of a point for discussion. The very hard cap here, though, is that absolute emissions cannot increase on Scope 3. So if you're not in line with the intensity reductions under GIVA or SDA, ultimately you will not be able to have an absolute increase in Scope 3 emissions. So this is really the Scope 3 emission targets. There's a second way of setting a target for Scope 3, which is a supplier engagement target. And if you want to set a supplier engagement target, the boundary needs to at least include 2/3 of your cradle to gate emissions from suppliers. That could maybe be estimated through covering 2/3 of your annual procurement spend. But it's important to know that even if you set this supply engagement target, ultimately you will need to cover 2/3 of your boundary. So it will not be applicable to every company. For example, if you have a lot of downstream emissions, this might not be the right approach for you. The minimum level of ambition of the targets that your suppliers need to set is commit to science-based targets for Scope 1 and 2. We strongly encourage to include Scope 3 as well, but the minimum requirement is that your suppliers that account for 2/3 of the credit gate emissions or the procurement spend set a science-based target for Scope 1 and 2 emissions. And then finally, the last criteria is that it should go out maximum 5 years. So you have 5 years time to actually drive this catalytic change in your supply chain to commit to science-based target. There's a lot of debate around this, and so if you have any questions, we would again ask to refer to the materials. And here's a bit of a good overview of what these materials specifically are. So for different stages, they actually see what different documents there are. For the commitment stage, the most important one is the call to action guidelines that will explain in a lot of detail what the specific requirements are once you commit to the call to action. And the commitment length I already mentioned is the key, I guess, form you fill out for that. For target development, I think Nate already gave a great insight into what is out there. So we have a draft science-based target manual that's on the website that's currently being updated. So some specific sections might not necessarily be as up to date as it was like, but shortly there'll be an updated version. Just make sure that you cross-reference the manual to the latest criteria. And we have the SDA tool on the website. We have just a lot of other information on the website. So there's a wealth of information really about how to set a science-based target. The key protocols and procedures for that are just following the SBTi criteria and recommendations, and also refer to the FAQ, where some of the more complex points might be explained in a bit more detail than in the actual criteria. And then finally, I guess this target submission form is what we would use to submit your target. And then for the target validation, there's a specific protocol that we have in-house. So there's a very standardized approach to make sure there's consistency and comparability to the approach of how targets get evaluated. And ultimately, I guess there'll be a target validation report that's received by the company, just to make sure it's transparent why certain decisions were made. And if it hasn't passed, then there'll be some recommendations of how to actually address the shortfalls. And then finally, once the target is announced, there's a welcome pack that we get, and we'll just work closely together with you and make sure that communication is smooth and actually get the most value out of it that we can. Thanks very much for your attention. I think I'm looking forward to the Q&A, and apologies for the sound problems. I hope that wasn't as bad down the line.
Thank you, Alex, for that. Very well covered, and there's a lot of details that, as like you said, can be also found on our website. So we did receive quite a few questions, and we might not have time to cover all of them, not live, but we will definitely follow up after this session as well. But a question for you, Alex, around Scope 2 and 3. So how can the SDA method be used for Scope 2 and Scope 3 emission targets?
So I guess the SDA method is applied. So for the Scope 2 targets, the approach is that the Energy Technology Perspectives report that comes from the IEA actually has a global emission budget for the power sector. And at the same time, it has a projected energy demand for each sector, that gives you a sense of how much of the global power production will actually be electricity production will actually be drawn from each sector. So by understanding the emission pathway and the emission intensity per kilowatt hour, you can actually apply that to your Scope 2 targets, and you'll have a very specific pathway for Scope 2 emissions. For the Scope 3 emissions, I guess there's different lenses you could take on it. I mean, ultimately, if you want to apply the intensity pathway for a homogeneous sector to your own intensity of Scope 3, that would be a valid approach. If you could demonstrate that actually you have emission hotspots in different sectors. So, for example, in iron and steel or cement that are replicated in the SDA, you could try and actually commit to reductions that are along this pathway, so that you try and reduce reductions from specific commodities in line with the SDA. So those are, I guess, the two main ways. There's a fair bit of complexity to it. So again, I guess it's something that we could maybe discuss offline.
Great, thank you so much. And we have another question around the actual selections of scenarios. And I thought I'll bring in Nate for this question. So what would be the company information needed in order to select a scenario?
Good question, thank you. So there are a few different criteria that I mentioned in terms of the company context. I think it depends partially on the company's basic reason for doing this. Some companies are doing the right thing. Some are future-proofing their growth, as Heidi mentioned. Some are trying to increase their competitiveness. And it depends partially on where the company is compared to their peers and their opportunities to reduce emissions. Generally, we encourage companies to look at that first IEA 2-degree pathway as the minimum threshold to understand, whether they can meet that. If they can surpass that, we certainly support companies going for higher levels of mitigation ambition, and we can provide the corresponding scenarios. So I see it as sort of an iterative process. You start at sort of, it depends on your company culture and where you're coming from as well. So some companies have different approaches to risk. Some really want to have a very clear, granular understanding of exactly how they will get to the target that's being discussed. And they have, budgets and particular investments and expectations for how they'll get there. Other companies are much more comfortable with a reach target where there's still a gap between their expected performance and where they need to be. And the whole purpose of the target is to spur innovation, investment, and new thinking about how to get there. So it really varies per company. There's no one answer, but we have corresponding emission scenarios that can link with different company ambition, again, with that minimum threshold of 2 degrees.
Great, thank you so much, Nate. And I think that actually ties in nicely to our next speaker. We have with us, and we're very happy to have with us Marie-Pierre Bousquet from Danone, who can actually also probably tackle some of these topics around, why a company is setting a science-based target and also how that was being done. I know that you, Marie, would also share with us kind of the benefits and the key learnings that you have as a company, and we look forward to hear more from you. So let me just ask you a first question to kick our conversation off, and because we were talking a little bit about the drivers on why companies are setting a science-based target. Would you like to explain a little bit more on what was the business case for Danone to set a science-based target?
Absolutely. So good morning to everyone. First, thanks to UN Global Compact for the invitation, and I hope that our experience will inspire other companies. So it is important to remind the Assembly that Danone started its journey to tackle climate change 10 years ago. And between 2008 and 2016, we achieved a 50% reduction in intensity, excluding agriculture, but covering some Scope 3 categories. And we decoupled GHG emissions from sales growth. As a food company, the next challenge was to embrace the whole value chain, including agricultural commodities. So that's why in November 2015, during the COP21, we announced our ambition to make our full value chain carbon neutral by 2050. The question was now how to do it. The company released its climate policy at that time with a 50 reduction target in intensity by 2030 on a full scope basis, scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. During the COP21, it was obvious for Danone to answer yes to the call to action of the Women Business Coalition. And at the same time, actually, Emmanuel Faber signed the commitment letter of the Science Based Target Initiative as well. So really, we started the process very early, I would say, in November 2015. We are sincerely convinced that it is a great opportunity for companies. The initiative, as has just been described, is providing methodologies that enabled us to define reduction trajectories adapted to our business model and in line with climate science.
Great. Great. No, that's wonderful to hear. And I think, you know, it would also be good to hear more on what was the process like in Danone internally with kind of preparing for the commitment and then working on getting the target you know, prepared for the validation process. Do you have any key learnings that you would like to share with the companies that we have online on this process that you had?
Yes, absolutely. I think that it would be useful for the audience to understand better how we did it. As mentioned before, we had first a reduction target in intensity on the full scope basis, and we needed to get a breakdown of this target on the different categories of our GHG emissions. So the main challenges faced were to set a reduction target first in absolute terms for the scope 1 and 2. It was not the case in our climate policy. We just had this ambition to be carbon neutral by 2050 and a global, I would say, intensity target on scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. But really to be able to then activate initiatives internally, we needed really to define more precise trajectories on our different activities. And our products have very different carbon profiles. So it is something that needs to be, let's say, understood. The fresh dairy and the baby food, for example, are much more carbon intensive than the packed beverages due to the nature of ingredients and packaging and the manufacturing processes that are used. So to apply the sectoral decarbonization approach that has been just mentioned, we needed to allocate activity data and emission to the relevant 2 degrees decarbonization pathways. And at the end, we got a calculation model with reduction targets at different levels of the organization, especially for each worldwide business units, which the relevant level of granularity. For instance, we got, and we have today, some trajectories to reduce the carbon footprint of the milk supply at each region level. Sorry. So it is really a very useful tool and dynamic tool, which is very important for companies. It is not static. You can reuse the model over time to adjust your trajectory, taking into account your achievement since your baseline year. And it helped us really to understand much better our value chain. At the end, we defined a 30% reduction target in absolute terms of scope 1 and 2, and we got the validation of our intensity target on the full scope, the combination of the scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. But on the scope 3, we got really the breakdown by, I would say, internally the different levels of the organization, and also by the different types of activities. And the project triggers also additional commitments. To achieve our target of reduction in scope 1 and 2, and especially for the scope 2, we decided to join then the RE100 initiative, and we set the objective to source 100% renewable electricity by 2030, to be absolutely consistent with the target of reduction that has been defined previously. So I hope it helps to figure out better how we can work internally in an organization.
Great. So it really sounds like there's also a lot of backup from the leadership with being very ambitious in your approach from the beginning, which probably has been quite helpful for you as well to in actually implementing the vision of Danone. So a last question, you must have a huge supply chain. So how do you engage with your supply chain on the Science Based Targets initiative?
As you mentioned, we have a huge supply chain. The scope 3 is representing 80% of our total emission, and the agricultural part is representing 60%. So 2 years ago, Danone accelerated its internal, let's say, transformation and adapted its organization to be able to co-build also solution with its partners. And the milk and plastic cycles inside the procurement teams are engaging today on a daily basis with our different suppliers and with our farmers to activate and find solutions on the field. We are part, to provide you a few examples, we are part of the Cool Farm Alliance with other companies, and the milk cycle teams are working closely with our farmers to reduce their environmental impacts. So we are very close to our suppliers to be able to activate locally what we need to do to reduce our GHG emissions. During also the COP23, Emmanuel Faber, our CEO, affirmed the focus on regenerative agriculture. Really to build for the future, let's say, new models based on healthy and resilient soils, because we are absolutely convinced that those models can address a number of global challenges, from climate change to water and biodiversity protection. We are absolutely convinced that everything is connected, and it is really well, I would say, reflected by our new signature, One Planet, One Health. It is our motto at Danone, to take into account really those challenges on a very holistic way. To be much more precise on the action plans that we are activating again, Danone implemented some social innovation funds. And to give you a few examples, the Danone Ecosystem Fund is supporting the transformation of agricultural practices in the supply chain through 35 projects across the world. So when we are designing those projects, our country business units are part of and are managing the project locally to be sure that at the end we have results that we can really account in our supply chain. We have also a very interesting, let's say, example. It is the Livelihoods Fund for Family Farming that we implemented with other companies, with Mars, for instance. And thanks to this fund, we will empower 1,000 family farms with sustainable practices to improve productivity and social impact, which is very important. Those are social funds, innovation funds, while also preserving environment. So those projects are mainly developed in Asia, Latin America, and Africa. And today, currently, the team is implementing a full sustainable vanilla production in Madagascar. And I invite you to go to our website to see all those beautiful projects that are developed around the world.
Great, thank you so much. I think that was very helpful and very interesting to hear on how you make the connections also between climate and the broader sustainable development agenda. And the benefits of being at the forefront on climate action and the benefits that you can see on the overall sustainability topic. So thank you for sharing your experiences, and thank you for also working so consistently with the Science Based Targets Initiative and making sure that this is also something that is seen throughout your Scope 3 emissions as well. That's great leadership from you, so we thank you for sharing that with us here today. And if our audience is interested to hear more examples like Danone, I really encourage you to go to our website. There's more case studies from other sectors, from other regions on how companies did set a science-based target. And now let's move to the very last segment of today's session. And I'm very glad to introduce to you Alberto Carrillo Pineda, who is the Director of Science-Based Targets and Renewable Energy at CDP. Alberto is one of our main experts on the Science-Based Targets initiative and our champion of the initiative as well. So he will speak a little bit more about what is next after the company has made the commitment. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Heidi. Thanks everyone for your time, and thanks UN Global Compact for organizing this webinar. So yeah, we just have a brief summary about how this connects to the global process. You can go to the next slide, please. Basically, earlier this year at the World Economic Forum, Mr. Anand Mahindra, who is the chairman of the Mahindra Group, one of the largest conglomerates in India, launched a challenge to the business community, asking, well, first of all, committing that the Mahindra Group would set science-based targets for the entire group, and also inviting other companies to set science-based targets with an aspirational goal of reaching 500 companies by the Global Climate Action Summit that is happening in September. Actually, I think it's in 50 days from today. If you go to the next slide, please. And today we have 436 companies that have formally joined the Science Based Targets Initiative. Out of these, 120 companies have already had their targets validated by the Science Based Targets Initiative. And in average, we have about 2 companies that join the Science Based Targets Initiative every week. And since this call to action was launched by Anand Mahindra, we have nearly 20 companies that are joining the Science Based Targets Initiative every month. So that's really great news, and I would say a very positive sign about the level of adoption of science-based targets in the corporate sector, and the way in which companies are responding to align to the goals set in the Paris Agreement. If you go to the next slide, please. And yeah, this chart shows the growth that the Science Based Targets Initiative has had since the call to action was formally launched. This happened 6 months ahead of COP21 when the Paris Agreement was adopted. And as I just mentioned, we are trying to get to 500 companies by September. You go to the next slide. At the moment, we have companies headquartered in nearly 40 different countries. And this chart represents the countries with the largest number of companies that have set or committed to set science-based targets. And as you can see, we have companies from every single continent, from east and west. Most of the companies at the moment come from North America, from Europe, and from Asia, especially from Japan. But we're also seeing a great increase in companies from India and from other countries as well. And this week we announced the first South African company, last week, sorry, the first South African company with an approved science-based target. So this shows the variety of companies that are joining this movement. Next slide, please. And yeah, it's since the call to action was launched first in 2015, and then with the second call to action launched by Anand Mahindra earlier this year, we have seen really an increase in also the profile and endorsement to companies that are setting science-based targets. And right now, for instance, the UNFCCC is encouraging companies to also set science-based targets, and this is one of the central challenges that is being promoted for the Global Climate Action Summit. And so there's a lot of profiling opportunities for companies that are setting science-based targets. And I don't know what happened. Yeah, and this is basically the final slide, and it's just an invitation to be part of this movement, to help reach the goal of getting to 500 companies by GCAS, but more importantly, to be part of the global movement to keep global warming below 2 degrees, to help send a positive signal to governments ahead of the new NDCs that are going to be discussed and that are being currently prepared. And hopefully we are going to be sending a positive signal from the corporate sector before 2020, when many countries will be putting new country commitments. And that's it from me. Thank you very much for your time again.
Great. Thank you so much, Alberto, for going to the final practical parts of setting a science-based target. We have been getting some answers. Some of these have been answered throughout. If your question wasn't answered, we will take them all together and come back to you also after the session. There'll be more materials to be shared with you after this session as well. And thanks to all of our speakers today. Thanks to everyone joining at today's session. You really are the stakeholders who can make a difference and who can show governments that business are ready to take action and ready to implement the Paris Agreement, and the Science Based Targets Initiative is a great way of showing that. So before we close up, I really also wanted to say that we take feedback very seriously, and we would love to hear your feedback. So in the chat, you can see the answers that we would encourage you to come back to us. We will be making more UN Global Compact Academy sessions this fall as well, and we hope to see you at those sessions. They will be covering other topics of the UN Global Compact. And we also hope to see many of you in California in September, as well as the General Assembly week, as well as the COP meeting later this year. So thanks everyone for joining, and have a great rest of the day. Thank you.
Thanks all.